So, a draft set of rules for protecting Indians' personal digital data is out after years of debate and discussion. And the most interesting aspect of the rules is the way it deals with children. So, one of the rules says that individuals below the age of 18 require verifiable parental consent while accessing social media apps, e commerce websites, or gaming applications. What's more, the onus of collecting that consent and age gating access is on the websites and said platforms. Now, the ill effects of internet overuse on children cannot be overstated. And India isn't alone in stipulating rules to e-protect them. In fact, countries across the world have come up with such regulations. Many even have finer classifications for different age groups. For instance, children aged 6 to 12 and 13 to 18 are treated differently in some countries. India has, of course, kept it at one single slab of below 18 years. So, what are these rules saying? What is the growing impact or ill impact of social media and other addictive sites and apps on children? How will websites and applications, or the so-called data fiduciaries, follow the verification process? How will they detect lies, for instance? What are the other challenges they will face? All this and more in today's episode. It's Tuesday, the 7th of January. I'm your host Anirban Chaudhary. This is the Morning Brief. I started by asking Ashish Aryan, ET's Deputy Bureau Chief Technology, about what he thinks of these rules for children.
So this is one of the most interesting and most contentious clauses of the bill, and there's been much back and forth on what it should be and what it should not be. So if we go into a little bit of background of what it tries to achieve, is that world over, most governments are now saying that social media platforms are extremely toxic and extremely harmful, especially for teenagers and young kids and young adults. Therefore, most governments have set down on that path that they will sort of ensure that the kids who are using, or the children who are using social media platform, they are protected from the evils of excessive social media use. So one of the aspects, or one of the easiest ways that most governments found, was that it should be verifiable consent from parents that their child is using social media, or that their child is going on social media or and interacting with an ex stranger or a Y person. So they should be aware of what their child is doing on these platforms. That's the idea of verifiable parental consent. Let's say if my child wants to go on social media and log in, the onus to verify that I am a legitimate adult, and B, I am related to the child. Both these responsibilities now squarely lie on these social media platforms. They will have to verify that I am an adult, and that I live at such and such place or whatever, and that I exist in this world. And then the second part is that I am indeed related to that child.
How does that
So
happen? How will they verify that?
that can be verified through a variety of mechanisms. What the government has done is that instead of prescribing that social media platforms should use, let's say, an Aadhaar or a PAN or a voter ID card or a school certificate, etc., it has said that all this is your responsibility on how you want to determine it. You can do it through a digital service locker provider also, such as DigiLocker, where all your document is, all the documents of the child and the parent is kept at one place, and then you can cross verify by matching the details of whether the child and the parent is living at the same address, and whether they have the same date of birth does the date of birth of father mentioned in the child's document match with the date of birth mentioned of the father, etc. So all that, of course, can be verified, and then a token can be generated that yes, this is correct or this is not correct. And if something goes wrong, the government can always turn up and say, did you get verifiable parental consent of this child? And if you did, so is the procedure that you followed. And if there is some discrepancy, the social media platform can, of course, always be hauled up by the government.
Got it. But in case of a minor, is the data principal the minor himself or herself, or is it the parent?
No, one of the major points is that in the case of a minor, or in the case of any person who, let's say, are not mentally fit to give that consent, the guardian who is there is the data manager, so to say, or the manager of consent of that minor. And anything that the minor does, if let's say a minor wants to go and purchase something online, uh, they must get verifiable parental consent, and the parent must be aware about it, that their
For
child is
each
doing such and
purchase.
such. Sorry,
For each purchase, is it?
for each purchase that
Oh,
is
wow.
there. So
Wow.
in a way, it cracks down on any such purchases that are there. And of course, the parent then has complete control on what their child is doing, online. Are they getting into trouble? Are they getting into the wrong groups? Is a stranger who's not supposed to talk to the child talking to the child? So most of these social media platforms, they already have these parental control options where the parent can go and monitor what the child is doing online, or especially on the platform. But with these clauses now put into place as a rule in the act itself, the onus increases on these companies to be further very, very sure that if, let's say, my child is on a platform X, then they will also need to be absolutely sure that the person who has been given parental controls is indeed the parent and not some random person who the child just tricked into signing up as parent for them.
Understood. Understood. And what about if the child lies about their age?
So, if children lie about their age, which I mean, to be very practical, has been happening. Almost all these social media platforms say that they have tools and they have frameworks and they have flags in place through AI and ML training of the data and the way a user behaves, which can flag if a user lies about their age and says that I am, let's say, above 18 and they are not 18, and that account is immediately flagged. Platforms claim that once we catch them, we either ask them to prove their age. If they are unable to prove their age, we deplatform them, no questions asked.
Now, just to circle back to how critical the rules are in the way they deal with children, a 2021 report by the National Commission for Protection of Child Rights highlights that approximately 30% of children aged 8 to 18 own smartphones, and 62% access the internet via their parents' phones. About 43% have active social media accounts. That number would have gone up exponentially by now. Research from India as well as across the world also shows both the digital divide and disparities in access to digital devices, while also revealing a concerning link between excessive social media usage and increasing levels of stress, anxiety, and depression. Yes, amongst children and adolescents. Here's Geetika Kapoor, founder of Ed Essential and a consulting school psychologist.
We need to understand that the social media sites, gaming apps, and various e commerce platforms have what we call a high reward cycle to them. Their algorithms are programmed to attract more and more customers, bring back as many people as possible. And it is kind of said that all these sites have such rewarding effects that cannot match the mundane, everyday, normal, regular life. So, all these websites, all these platforms tend to overcompensate the kind of social interaction or mundane life requirements, where even the growth of various other skills that children can have, kind of sideline. And the just the reward seeking or pleasure seeking behavior is kind of reinforced again and again, which kind of makes even regular pain or struggle or any other negative emotion unbearable. And that's where we see also addictive behaviors being prevalent when people are engaging with these platforms. Children we regard as more vulnerable because they are in that developmental period where they have yet to get exposed to a wider skill set. All learning any new skill set has its own struggles. Nothing comes without pain. And at early stage, when they discover so much of pleasure, it seems like this is life. And anything that is new and overwhelming is sidelined, and more pleasure seeking or comfort seeking behavior then takes in. So, in that aspect, it is a great interference in the regular developmental process.
Understood. So these new data protection rules, they sort of
Hmm.
make it mandatory for verifiable parental consent for children
Hmm.
aged below 18 years to be
Mhm.
able to access these sites. How effective do you think they will be?
So, one, it would require a very, very conducive working relationship for a parent and child to know that we are on the same side. We cannot be using punishment or a punitive measure kind of a parenting when doing this. So we have to use the language of education and information sharing, the harms, why a parent needs to take certain measures. Without creating this context, it will not be able to sustain itself. So all these policies need to back up with support systems that are sustainable, where people are not needing to spend a lot to get those support systems. And how we build all of that ecosystem will then ultimately decide whether these policies can sail the course.
Now, in a recent note, Ikigai Law, a corporate legal firm, said that the aspect of processing children's data, among other things, needs a closer look. Here's Neha Chaudhary, partner at Ikigai Legal.
Where we are right now is essentially there are three things, right? Like, very simply, anybody below the age of 18 is considered to be a child. And the obligation is on data fiduciaries or data controllers, as they are called in other markets, to verify, to obtain verifiable parental consent before you are processing the data of any child. Now, this basically creates obligations on three levels. Basically, one is you have to establish that a child is the child. Second, you have to establish the parent is the parent. And third, it is that you have to establish that there exists a parent child relationship between, between these two people. And historically, across iterations, there have been concerns with the obligations on three levels, right? One is the age of the child itself. And I think on this, in India, perhaps that ship has sailed. For a long time now, companies have been talking to the government and saying, can you look at a tiered approach that perhaps exists in other markets? There are other countries, including the GDPR, including the COPPA in the US, which look at uh,
GDPR in Europe.
so the
Okay, got it.
GDPR in Europe and the COPPA in the US,
Right.
where you look at, say, in the latter, you look at the age of 13 and the fact that you have strict parental consent requirements for kids below the age of 13, because you do understand that kids, especially for social media platforms, teenagers are going to be using certain kinds of platforms and, accessing the internet in certain ways. But I do think in India, even perhaps that ship has sailed. I feel like 18 is not something, at least for the foreseeable future, that we're going to have too much leeway with. Maybe as the law evolves, as we get as the data protection law in the country becomes a little bit more mature, we may revisit this at some point many years down the line. But I think for the foreseeable future, it's going to be 18. The second is, uh, who needs to verify an age gate, right? And how do you go about doing that? And again, this is a concern that's been raised in earlier iterations as well, that are you going to end up moving towards a scenario where you're basically age gating the entire internet? I don't think that that's the intent of the government. I feel like it might end up being an inadvertent effect. But again, in other parts of the world where we've seen specific language that says, um, organizations should have age verification or age gating mechanisms based on the kind of content that can be accessed, right?
Mhm.
And the level of risk that's involved in the online activity. So sure, if you're a website for adult content, having a checkbox that says, I confirm that I'm over the age of 18 may not quite cut it. But if you're like a news website, right? Like, should you really be worried about verifying the age and identity of every single person that is coming up on your platform to consume the kind of content? So at least in the letter of the law, we're not seeing this kind of nuance come through. So you have to do a little bit more of something to restrict access to kids below 18, or to ensure that, conversely, folks above the 18 only have access.
Also, the other challenge is, how do you age gate? Neha, what do you have to say about that?
If you look at the rules now, they, I think, envisage two scenarios. One is a scenario where the parent has an existing account with the data fiduciary, right? Is in some way, shape, or form an existing customer, or it's an existing user of the platform, in which case the data fiduciary can rely on the data of the parent that they already have on record. But what happens if I am not an existing user of the platform, right? If I'm creating an account on a social media platform for my child, or if I'm creating an email account for my kid, how much leeway do I really have as a company to figure out what is the method for age verification? Then do I have to fall back to government IDs, or to this digital token, or to DigiLocker as the rules are envisaging, right? So I feel like that bit is going to be a little bit tricky. It's going to be interesting in terms of how it plays out. Perhaps a little bit more flexibility here. I don't know how practical it is to say, do this token based verification, or government ID based verification, or DigiLocker. Perhaps a little bit more practical approach. And again, I don't think we're necessarily seeing too much alignment in regulators around the world on what kind of approaches, work. Where I do think that there is alignment is that just a mere self declaration is not enough. But what is enough, we're seeing some disparity in governments around the world. The Quantum Hub a few months ago had actually come up with a pretty good report on how verifiable parental consent works across around the world, and I'd recommend folks take a look at that.
Now, according to the Quantum Hub report that Neha just mentioned, courts in countries like the United States have ruled against hard age verification mandates, arguing that they will affect citizens' ability to freely navigate the internet and express themselves. UK's Children's Court 2021 has conferred flexibility in age verification and age assurance mechanisms based on the type of content that could be accessed and the level of risk involved in the online activity. As Neha said, Europe's GDPR requires data controllers to undertake verification with regard to age and parental consent. Currently, the GDPR allows individual member states limited flexibility in determining the national age of digital consent for children between the ages of 13 and 16. Meanwhile, regulators in Australia and France have concluded that none of the existing age assurance technologies satisfy standards of sufficiently reliable verification, complete coverage of the population, and upholding privacy of citizens. So in the Indian context, this aspect of the rules is something that will entail much more discussion and debate in the coming months before we can decide whether our children are well and truly protected from digital evils. That's it for today. You were listening to this episode on The Morning Brief It was produced by me and Surohini Jain and sound designed by Amrit Reggie. The Morning Brief drops every Tuesday, Thursday and Friday on a listening platform of your choice. Have a good rest of the week.